University, I would like to welcome you to our 17th annual celebration commemorating the life of Reverend Martin Luther King Jr. It is especially nice to see students from various junior high and high schools throughout Salt Lake. Thank you for coming and welcome. I would also like to recognize our Associate Vice President of Diversity, Karen Dees, and thank her and the Office of Diversity for their support. In conjunction with this year's celebration titled Beyond the Guilt and Blame, Healing with Hands and Hearts, we invite you to join us for our cultural event at Kingsbury Hall this Monday, January 15th at 7 p.m. The evening will honor student recipients of the annual Martin Luther King Jr. Youth Leadership Award and will include Rio Bravo, Raging Tycho, the Calvary Baptist Church Choir, students from Lincoln Elementary School and the U of U Children's Dance Theater, and students, faculty, and staff from the departments of ballet, modern dance, and theater. This event, by the way, is free and open to the public, and tickets can be obtained through ArtTix locations. In addition, KUED Channel 7 will broadcast Moris, Dees, Fighting for Justice, an interview with today's keynote conducted by Teresa Martinez, Professor of Sociology and President of the Faculty Senate, at 5 p.m. and again 9:30 p.m. this Sunday, January 14th. After his address, if time permits, Mr. Dees has consented to take questions from the audience. Again, we are delighted to have you all here and hope you will participate in our other events this Martin Luther King Jr. weekend. And now to introduce our keynote speaker is the President of the University of Utah, J. Bernard Manchin.
Thank you, Liz. What a great sight to see an overflow crowd here today. It really warms my heart. Can you all hear me okay? Is the audio working fine? Even for those of you who are having to stand up in the back, the nods say okay. This is a great occasion for us, and we're so delighted to have you here to help us celebrate Martin Luther King Jr. Events associated with the university. I would note that this is a great time for the state of Utah. This is the first time we've had this celebration when Martin Luther King Jr. Day is recognized as a state holiday. I'm particularly tickled to be here today because I get to introduce a genuine American hero. At a time in our life when there aren't many people who qualify, Moris Dees is clearly a great man in our lifetime. I have special pride in this introduction because Moris and I are both from the state of Alabama, and we just compared geography. He lives very close to where I grew up as a small boy, so we're honored to have an Alabamian out here in the great Intermountain West. Moris Dees is in fact an American hero. His civil rights work is truly inspiring. Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. said, "He who passively accepts evil is as much involved in it as he who helps to perpetuate it." There is nothing passive about Moris Dees. He is best known as the co-founder of the Southern Poverty Law Center. The center, which coincidentally opened for business 30 years ago this month, has crippled some of the nation's largest white supremacist organizations by helping victims of racist violence sue for monetary damages. The center has won judgments against the United Klans of America, the White Aryan Resistance, and other Klan organizations. Its work has earned millions for victims of racist violence, put hate groups out of business, and put Mr. Dees at personal risk from those who perpetuate hate. The Southern Poverty Law Center also does work to protect worker safety, to challenge prison conditions, and to improve health care for the poor. Mr. Dees is very involved with the center's education project, Teaching Tolerance, which has distributed magazines, teaching kits, and videos free of charge to schools. The video in the first kit A Time for Justice, won an Academy Award. Mr. Dees has written several books, including his autobiography, A Season for Justice, and his life was the subject of a made-for-TV movie, Line of Fire. Mr. Dees is the recipient of numerous honors and awards, including a Civil Rights Award from the National Bar Association, a Humanitarian Award from the University of Alabama, and the Martin Luther King Jr. Memorial Award from the National Education Association. I mentioned earlier he's from my home state of Alabama. Let's give him a Utah welcome. Moris, Dees.
I think it's you who should be receiving the applause for gathering together here to honor the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King in such great numbers. I've been around this country before, speaking to students and leaders during times like this when Dr. King was honored, but never have I ever seen this type of a turnout. And it's my pleasure to be here, and especially to be introduced by a homeboy from Alabama. You know, as I was thinking this morning what I might say about the Reverend Dr. King, I thought that, you know, it was Dr. King who, to ensure that America lived up to its promises of equality, written in our Constitution in 1776, had to face many of his contemporaries who foolishly stood in his way, politicians with little or no backbone, and finally a terrorist with no conscience. But now, over 30 years after his death, it's Dr. King, a true American hero, that we honor, not those who stood in his way and tried to block him, and those that followed him. And as we think, as young people, and as we study this great nation that was founded upon the principles of freedom, and we study about the American Revolution, let's hope that Dr. King and his followers led the final battle for the struggle for independence. As we look at this nation today and on the verge of a new millennium, a new century, we have a lot to be proud of. And you have a lot to look forward to. Because this is a great time to be alive in this world, and especially in this nation. And as you young people, whatever your grade might be, begin to plan for your future, you can see advances in medicine, in education, in art, in science that I could never dream about. And I didn't come here today to honor Dr. King to put this great nation down. But as we enter this next century, there is, in spite of all the good things about this nation, there's an ill wind blowing across our country. In 1995, there was one hate website on the internet. And today, there are 450. The FBI tells us that over 9,000 hate crimes occurred last year. Many of them you don't read about in your newspapers, like the dragging death of James Byrd behind a pickup truck in Texas by 2 members of the Ku Klux Klan, or the beating death of Matthew Shepard, a gay student at the University of Wyoming who was left to die in the desert just because of his sexual orientation, or the Aryan Nation Guard who walked into a Jewish daycare center in Los Angeles last September and gunned down innocent little children simply because they were Jewish. There are many, many other hate crimes that are painful. They're ripping apart the very fabric of our nation. And we still live in a country where people judge other people who are different than they are in some stereotypical manner. There's a battle going on, and I especially want to talk to young people about it today, because that is a battle, or campaign might be a better word, that you're going to have a chance to take part in. You'll take part in it by either doing nothing and letting someone else set the agenda, or you'll get involved to try to make America the great nation that it can be. And that's a battle over whose America is this, and whose version of America is going to prevail into the next century. And I can assure you that there are people who feel very strongly about their version of this nation. They feel strong enough to fill a truck with 4,000 pounds of ammonium nitrate fertilizer soaked with diesel fuel, drive it up in front of a federal building, and explode it, with little or no thought to the innocent men, women, and children inside. And when Timothy McVeigh drove away from that building, he couldn't have helped but have felt that awful impact that was caused by him striking a match to make his stand for the America that he believed in. And when he heard that explosion, when it rocked the car he was driving, and it might come as a shock to you, he felt and thought of himself as a hero, as a patriot, as a good soldier. We handled a case a few years ago out in Oregon that I think really brings into focus this battle that's going on, that's going to affect your lives in the future. We represented a family from Ethiopia, black people in that country, in northern Africa, who had a son. His name was Mulugeta Sarah, 24 years old, had done well in a school back there, and his parents got some money up, they were very poor, to send him to Portland, Oregon to go to college. Mulugeta had to leave his small son and wife behind, and when he went to the airport in Addis Ababa, his dad was standing there with him, and he turned to his father and he said, "You know, I am so happy to be going to America. I've heard so many great things about America. If you work hard and make good grades and stay out of trouble and save your money, you have a good chance of getting ahead." And he said, "Dad, I'm going to make you proud of me." And when Mulugeta got to Portland to go to Portland Community College, he got a job at Avis Rent-A-Car, driving people in a van from where the cars are parked out to the main building. And a lot of times people would leave personal items on his van, a billfold, umbrella, and Mulugeta would use his own money on many occasions to send it back to them. And for his good deeds, while he was still a student at the age of many of you students here, he was elected Employee of the Month for Avis Rent-A-Car. But there was another man who lived 1,200 miles to the south of Portland, Oregon, down in Fallbrook, California, who had a different idea about America. His name was Tom Metzger. You may have heard of him. He's been on all the television talk shows. And at 54 years old, having been a failed politician, he set up an organization called the White Aryan Resistance, or WAR, W-A-R. And he began to recruit young skinheads, racist young people, to join his organization, and he told them, he said, look, America's a great nation, but America's going to fall from its position of greatness just like the Roman Empire did unless we get those people out of our midst who are bringing us down. And he called those people mud people, people who weren't white like him, Americans of Asian descent, African descent, Hispanics, Jews, and others. And he told his followers, when it's necessary to go around and create acts of racial violence, we know them as hate crimes, to hurry on the day that these people will be driven out of America so we can save this nation. And he sent one of his organizers up to Portland to organize a group of skinheads there. This young man was named Dave, and this young man met with some skinheads in Portland. Mexico had some 50 cities with his skinhead groups in the nation. And this young man told the necessary means of creating this race war, so to speak, that they had to commit acts of racial violence. And 2 weeks after he was there, 3 skinheads went out on the street, having heard him give Metzger's message, and late at night, and they saw a black man getting out of a car, walking across an apartment lawn towards the apartment building. And they rushed over and they punched him in the chest and they called him racist names. And it was Mulugeta coming home from his nighttime job at Avis to get ready to go to school the next day. He said, peace, peace, please. No trouble. May I help you? And while they continued to taunt him, one of those 3 skinheads walked around behind Mulugeta, had a baseball bat tucked down behind his leg, and from Mulugeta's blind side, they took a full swing and crushed his skull. And Mulugeta died that night. The FBI and the city police quickly caught the 3 skinheads involved, and they got long prison sentences. I got a telephone call from a lawyer representing a family in Ethiopia saying, could you go out there and see if you could find somebody to bring a lawsuit against to get some money from that poor family back in Ethiopia that had lost its breadwinner. I met with the police and they were very helpful, but they said, well, look, you know, we know what you want to do, but those 3 skinheads, they have no money. They're all locked up for a long time. As I was about to leave, one officer reached in his desk drawer and pulled out a handwritten letter written by Metzger to the skinheads in Portland saying, when you meet Dave, our organizer, he'll tell you how we operate. And he elaborated, and he signed the letter, Tom Metzger for a White America. Our investigators found this Dave. Our intelligence people told us he had split from Metzger, and I talked to this young man who was in his early 20s, and he saw the error of his ways. He had a very troubled childhood, and he had learned a lot of hatred in his home, and he agreed to be a witness for us to tell that Metzger had told them to encourage violence. We had a trial. Metzger had good lawyers to represent him, but he wanted to make his own statements to the jury. We put on Dave, and he told about what Metzger told him to do. And then we put on other evidence, and finally the closing time for closing arguments began. Metzger stood before the jury and said, ladies and gentlemen, don't find me responsible just because my views are unpopular. This is America. I have the free speech rights to say what I want to say. I was 1,200 miles away. I didn't know the victims. I didn't know the people that did the killing. Don't hold me responsible. And then as he began to close his argument before that jury, he stood very erect. And I never will forget, because as I heard him begin to speak, I could see Adolf Hitler in those History Channel movies about World War II. And Metzger did everything to give a Sieg Heil salute. And he said, let me tell you something. I don't apologize for my views about this nation. I believe that America is a great nation because of the contributions of white people. And he sat down. I stood for a while before I made my closing arguments to that jury thinking, what can I say? Some people might believe that 3 guys in prison, why take this man's land and property? But I knew his free speech argument had no basis, because free speech is not a license to kill. I said, ladies and gentlemen, I want you to look at those 3 young people sitting behind Mexico in the first row of this courtroom. They're his 3 children. And not a single one of them had to worry about getting polio because of the genius of the Jewish doctor Jonas Salk, who invented the polio vaccine. And if we lived in Tom Metzger's America, we wouldn't have the brilliance of the African-American general Colin Powell. And I mentioned other people from other ethnic and racial backgrounds and told that jury their contribution to the greatness of this nation. And I said, you know, ladies and gentlemen, you have a chance today to make an important statement about our country. You know, the America that Tom Metzger believed in is an America that never existed. Our nation is great because of our differences, not in spite of them. That jury returned a very, very large verdict, the largest verdict ever returned in the history of the state of Oregon. Metzger's property was taken away, and this group really exists today in name only. And they're not organizing young people in skinhead groups around the country. And as I was driving to the airport, and finally when I got on the airplane to go back home to Alabama, having been away from my family for the better part of a year working on that case, relaxing for the first time after a tense trial, trying to think to myself, what did this case mean to me personally? And as that airplane reached cruising altitude and I kicked back the seat to relax, I looked out the window at this great nation passing below. The beautiful Rocky Mountains that you take so much for granted. And as I looked down over the Great Plains with the farms and the crops in the field, and then finally flying in over Atlanta to land, I thought to myself, you know, I really believe what I told that jury. I believe that America is a great nation because of the contributions of all of us. But why? Why so late in our history? Why 32 years after the death of the Reverend Dr. King? Why can't we all get along? Well, because of the surge of hate sites on the internet and the rash of hate crimes in this country, and some of the bitter things that politicians say, we did a little work at the Southern Poverty Law Center to find out what is going on in this nation. Our Teaching Tolerance Education program, its writers and others. And I have to tell you today that I'm proud to give you the good news. Because there is good news. Because most people in this nation we found when we went out into hamlets and villages and big cities around this country, they're saying almost in unison, which I'm sure most of you in this room would say, we are better than that. And they're doing 2 things. They're looking towards the victims of hate crimes, whether it be some school teacher who was fired because she might be gay, or some interracial couple who might have their car tires slashed because they weren't wanted in the neighborhood. Whatever the hate crime might be, people in this country are going to those victims and saying, you know, we feel your pain. We're with you. We support you. And then they're doing something else which I think you can participate in. They're meeting together in small groups, large groups, all over this country to try to build bridges across those divides that separate us in America. The divides that cause so much pain and so much hurt. The divides along the lines of color, that create the most hate crimes. The divide along the lines of sexual orientation that create probably the most number of hate crimes that go unreported and are seen to be, in many cases, the most violent. Along lines of gender, religion, those who are handicapped, those who are old, and those who may have economic goods and those who don't. Divisions along the lines of class. As we begin to look at the stories about what people are doing in this country, many of the stories that we heard were very emotional. They bring tears to your eyes to listen to them, of what good people in this country are doing. One of them comes to mind. The town was Billings, Montana. That's a town that's pretty much all white folks like myself. Most of you here live in a small town. Very few Jews live there, very few minorities. And a Jewish family there had a son, 6 years old, and they bought him a menorah. You know, the candle that has candles on it that are lit during Hanukkah, a Jewish holiday. And each night of Hanukkah they light a candle. And this little boy was so proud to get his own menorah, his candlestick holder, and he placed it in a window there in front of his house, and each night he would light a candle. And somebody saw that menorah there, and they threw a brick through the window and knocked it to the floor, and his parents moved it back because they were concerned. Somebody else saw what happened too. A businessman in that town, he wasn't Jewish, and he had a store, and on front of his store he had a marquee where he wrote on, like in a movie, you know, you put on the name of the movie, or he put on the things he had for sale there in his store, and he took all the letters down and he put instead, in place of those letters, "Not in our town." And then he began to organize in others, schools, students like you, churches, law enforcement agencies, and they made paper menorahs out of cardboard. And they had those placed in almost every window of every town in Billings facing the street in support of that hate crime victim. And one night after this campaign was underway, this mother and father took their little son around to see. As they drove down one street and up the other late in the evening, he could see those menorahs backlit from the lights inside. And he said, "Mom, Dad, I didn't know there were so many Jewish people living in Billings." And they said, "No, son, they're our friends." And therein, I think, lies the answer. When we build those bridges over those divides that separate us today, some that some of you young people in this state probably don't ever come in contact with, but will, those bridges across those divides that bring us together, we built in friendship and love and understanding. And I'm not talking about that kind of friendship and love you have for members of your own family. That's important. I actually have some members of my family I love in spite of them. I've got an old uncle that had a Klan robe, Ku Klux Klan robe, hanging in the back of his store at the little crossroads where I grew up in that cotton farming community. And but you know, I love my uncle because I understood him. I understood a lot of good things he did too in that community. He had a blind spot, and thank goodness he changed his views before he died. And I'm not talking about that kind of love and friendship you have with people that you eat lunch with every day, or that you go to church with every day, or synagogue, or mosque, or kinds of people that you might work with in your jobs, or play with at the school. It's important to be friends and love those people too, because there are differences that don't necessarily involve race that separate us. But I'm talking about understanding, appreciating, and caring about those people who are different than us. people who might have a different color skin, a different shape of their eyes, a different texture of the hair, who might have a different sexual orientation, a different gender, whose religion might not be yours, or they may have no religion at all. They might be old, they might be extremely overweight, or might be handicapped. But to understand and appreciate each person for the good that's in them and the good that they can do. And if those people don't always do good, to understand that it's our job to be friends and try to get them to be a part of our community. You know, America has faced some dark days. Dr. King, the man we're here to honor today, lived during a time of those dark days. I remember 1963, one of those dark times. Dr. King was 10 days out of the Birmingham jail, and I challenge you young people to go and read his letter that he wrote to the pastors of Birmingham who criticized him for taking young people and using them in the civil rights movement. Read that wonderful letter he wrote. He was 10 days out of Birmingham jail. I was 3 years out of the University of Alabama Law School. And after Dr. King got out of jail, a group of Klansmen placed dynamite in the stairwell of the 16th Street Baptist Church in Birmingham, a black church, and 4 little Sunday school girls died that day, simply because of the color of their skin. But you know, during that dark day, and that was 2 years before we had a Civil Rights and Voting Rights Act, those things were being blocked by powerful United States senators in Congress and others. Dr. King didn't give up. He had faith in all those people who was living in America then, and people like you, young people, yet to come. And he expressed that faith. He went to Washington, D.C. to express that faith in you. He stood on the Mall in Washington with 250,000 people at his feet. Millions watched on television as he expressed that faith in us. He said, I have a dream that one day in the red clay hills of Georgia, that the sons of former slaves and the sons of former slave owners will sit down around the table of personhood. Well, you know, a lot's happened since Dr. King left us. We've taken 3 steps forward and 2 steps backward. The issues have changed. They're not the same as they used to be. But I think if Dr. King was here today, he would still have faith in all of us. And I think if he was making that speech today, he might say that I have a dream that one day in the red clay hills of Georgia. But today, he might add, on the reservations, in the barrios, in the ghettos, and in the seats of economic and political power in this nation, that the sons and daughters of former slaves and the sons and daughters of former slave owners, and today, Dr. King might add, the homeless, the powerless, the poor, and those who hold the keys to the economic and political and judicial power of this nation will sit down around the table of personhood and truly learn to love one another. Dr. King handed us a great challenge. He lived an exemplary life for justice. And the challenge that he handed to each of you today is to understand that people are not born haters. They're not born to be prejudiced. That has to be taught. And so much of the hatred and prejudice that we have today towards others Sometimes we honestly don't realize that ourselves, because we make so many decisions that are based on first impressions. But you're going to become bankers, teachers, lawyers, doctors, workers, plumbers, all kinds of things in your life, scientists. And people are going to come before you, and you're going to make snap judgments about that person based on the biases that are built into our mind. And it's an easier thing to say than to do. But I hope that each of you will understand what Dr. King understood so well, that the desire for justice has burned in the hearts of men and women since the beginning of time. And justice for some of you young people, and maybe you'll understand it. I can give you a little story about my sister and I when I was about the age of most of you sitting down to my right. And my daddy would bring home a candy bar, a Baby Ruth candy bar was our favorite, and he'd bring it home from the country store. And I'll tell you, my sister had a fine sense of justice, because he would say, I don't know why he just brought one candy bar, but he maybe thought it would spoil our supper, because we'd eat it time we got it. He would say, now look, to my sister, you take this candy bar and you cut it in half, and you let your brother, me, choose the half I want. Well, let me tell you, my sister would get out a ruler, because she didn't want to lose one smidgen of chocolate. Well, Dr. King understood that same sense of justice and fairness that people crave. And he told an old story as he went around America that I want to leave with you. He told a story about another time in another nation and about justice. Because he was talking to an America that had strayed from its principles of fairness and justice written in our Constitution. Some had yet to have even been written in. It was 900 years B.C. The Jews had wandered, after being slaves, they had wandered from the country to country to find themselves a home. And they finally settled in a town near Jerusalem, and they built a big city, and they built big walls around this city, and they had gates in front of the city, and they did well. People brought their goods in from marketplaces from around. Farmers brought their goods in to sell, and those that prospered got nice building lots up on the hills, and they built nice homes overlooking the valley, and they had a court system, and they were doing pretty good. But there was one farmer who came from a neighboring village to bring his goods in. And when he came to town in his wagon loaded with his produce, he saw things that bothered him. He saw people, able-bodied people, sitting at those big gates early in the morning begging for food. And upon inquiry, he found that, well, maybe if you didn't know the right person, you didn't get a job. We might call that discrimination today. And then as he walked around in the marketplace, he heard grumblings that the court systems weren't fair, that sometimes people got arrested because of maybe they were different. And we might call that racial profiling today. And that bothered this farmer. You know this farmer. He was the prophet Amos. And he went to the leaders of that town and he said, look, if you're to keep the good things you have, if you're to pass them down to your children and your grandchildren, you're going to have to be fair to everybody. He said, you know, I hope that you will be fair, because I want you to succeed. And he spoke the words that Dr. Martin Luther King used so often to those people there at his meeting. And you can read this in the book of Amos. He said that I hope that you will not be satisfied until justice rolls down like waters and righteousness like a mighty stream. And I hope that you too, people of this great state, whose Mormon population has suffered some of the most egregious discrimination of any religious body in America, that you too will make America a place for all of us, and that you too will not be satisfied until justice does truly roll down like waters. Thank you so very much. Real close to the hour. I'll stay down front for a little while to ask questions if somebody wants to come down and ask me a question. But let me say this before I leave. On your tables, on your chairs, is a pamphlet called 101 Ways to Teach Tolerance, 101 Tools for Tolerance. That's part of our program that is called the National Campaign for Tolerance. And I'm honored to co-chair this with Mrs. Rosa Parks, the mother of the American Civil Rights Movement. And we hope to get 5 million Americans to sign the pledge in the back of this book and mail it to us so that we can present it on the 50th anniversary of Mrs. Parks sitting, or failing to give up her seat, I should say, on the bus in Montgomery. And I hope that any of those of you here are teachers, that you would check our website out, Teaching Tolerance, www.org, to see the teaching materials that we have available free to people all over this country. And in April, if you can remember, check out a website that we're putting up called tolerance.org, and I think you'll find it a fun thing to go to, an educational site, and you'll be able to take a test called an implicit association test to kind of check your biases and prejudices out against other people and maybe come up with some of the hidden things that you might not even be thinking about yourself. And lastly, I want to invite you to Montgomery, Alabama. When you come to the Deep South on a vacation, come by the Southern Poverty Law Center and see the memorial that sits in front of our office. It was designed by Ma Lin, who did the Vietnam War Memorial in Washington. And this memorial sits on the plaza of our building, and it honors the 40 men, women, and children who died in the struggle in the Civil Rights Movement. Thank you very much.